desenvolvimento e sustentabilidade. Que desafios para as organizações.
Good morning, Professor.
Please turn on your mic.
Okay.
How, Professor? Good morning.
I was muted.
How are you there in Australia?
I'm good. How are you?
Thank you so much for being here with us. We have talked about this talk, and I will start with some questions because we have all lots of curiosity to know everything about pandemics and what's happening in these crazy moments around the world. But we only have 30 minutes, so we will try to get really a good time with you in this 30 minutes we have. So I will ask you, what could we have done as human beings, as society, as nations, to prevent this COVID-19 pandemic?
It's what could we have done to prevent the pandemic? It's easy to come up with ideas in hindsight. We could have, or China could have stopped the planes going out of Wuhan earlier, but all of us in the infectious disease community thought in terms of what we've been saying for years with influenza, that you can't stop influenza by stopping the planes. Now we know that you can from the experience in Australia and New Zealand. When we did stop the planes, we stopped the virus coming in. But in Europe and in the United States, the virus was already in, I think, before people realized what was happening. We were trying with vaccines. There was an initiative called CEPI that was funded by Bill Gates and the international community, various people, to develop better vaccine platforms. Some of those are being used with the new vaccine development. China did the right thing when they released the sequence of the virus pretty much as soon as they got it, because that allowed people to start making vaccines, making the products, that is. But of course, as we all know, it takes a long time to test them and make sure they're safe and effective. Maybe the one thing we could have done is thought more about developing antiviral drugs that we might have had ready. Otherwise, I think our responses have been conditioned by previous pandemic planning, But because we haven't experienced anything like this, the pandemic has been finding what we could call holes in the bucket, if you like, if you think of it like a leak test. So I think we've done pretty well, but what this pandemic will tell us is how to be ready for the next one.
So it was very difficult to know everything about something completely new. And we are now watching, Professor, sometimes young people saying that, okay, if I get the virus, I go home, then I am 2 weeks at home, and then this goes away, and I will be very happy with my life. Can you explain us what is the impact in people, in young people? You could not die for the disease, but what's the impact to our future life?
Well, with respect to young people, of course, all young people will be aware that they could transmit it to older relatives. So I expect young people who are saying that are living in groups of young people and not where they're exposed to grandparents and older parents. But the point of fact is this is a completely new virus to us, and we've never seen anything quite like it before. We thought of it initially as being like influenza because it causes a pneumonia, shortage of breath and so forth. And it does that, but it doesn't work in the same way as influenza. It does damage the lung, but it does also cause coagulation, and you can have mini strokes and all sorts of things. Now, with respect to young people, we simply don't know whether there will be long-term health effects on those who catch it and maybe do get sick and are sick at home. We know that some people who are younger are what we call long haulers. It's taking a long, long time for them to get back to normal health. And we also know that some people are suffering severe heart damage and so forth. So it depends really on how young you're talking about, because it seems as we get older, up into our 30s, 40s, and 50s, we're certainly at more risk than we are in our 20s. Now, there is the story out there that many people are asymptomatic, but we know very early on from this disease that some people can have quite severe damage without feeling all that bad. And we do know from some early studies that were done in China and since that people who don't show much in the way of symptoms can nonetheless have lung damage. So we don't really know what the long-term effects will be. So if I were younger, I would try to avoid it. I mean, it's not as serious as it is in someone my age where it could be fatal, but I think it's best to try and avoid it if you can.
So we must be very careful about what's going to happen after the virus. No, I understand, as you, Professor, said, that there is a lot of unknown issues that we must deal with it. Thank you so much.
Yes, yeah. Viruses can have long-term consequences. They can cause autoimmune disease, one that we know of with influenza. It's quite a rare complication. It's called Guillain-Barré syndrome. They can also cause what we call post-viral disease. And there's some suggestion here in the media that this virus, coming from one of the neuroscience institutes, that it may later be associated with a higher incidence of Parkinsonism. So it's possible that a lot of people who do get symptomatic but don't have to go to hospital, or do go to hospital and then come out again, may have later effects or persistent effects. And we're wondering whether that will affect quality of life in the long term. Now, there are very big studies in progress on this at the moment, people trying to follow people who've had the disease, whether they're asymptomatic or they've had symptoms or they've been in hospital and so forth. Now, we haven't seen the results of those. We've seen a lot of reports in scientific papers and reports in the media, but we don't know what the incidence will be. And of course, when it comes to later effects, it's just too soon to know anything because we've only lived with this for less than a year so far. So there are a lot of unknowns out there. The way out of this, we hope, is a vaccine, but we're still waiting to hear results from that.
And about this issue, Professor, we heard about vaccination. We have some countries saying, we have the vaccine, let's try it. We have scientists saying, be careful, it's not tested. We have sometimes politicians say, almost like, drink gasoline, you get better. So sometimes you can say, like drinking a beer in Australia, you can get out of the virus, no?
Well, drinking beer is another thing, but, or drinking a good Rioja or something like that is also something else.
Here we have Porto wine and a wonderful...
wine.
Yeah, so Porto wine probably can help killing the virus, I don't know.
I think it definitely helps. I would be in no doubt about that whatsoever. Don't drink too much.
Yeah, so, but we have a lot of...
I think the recommendation to drink bleach is down to one political figure, but and maybe he wasn't saying that anyway, but it's bad advice. With respect to vaccines, it's very interesting at the moment. The countries like Portugal and Australia will be following the Western protocols that are agreed. You'll be following the protocols for vaccine licensing. I expect that are mandated by the European medical licensing authority. The Americans will be following the FDA guidelines. We'll be following our guidelines in our regulatory authority. I'm just reading in the Washington Post, the FDA is saying they're not interested in licensing anything until they've seen 2 months out from the second shot of a vaccine. If that's the case, it would mean there'd be no possibility of a vaccine being launched before Election Day, as President Trump wants. So I don't think that's going to happen. But we're waiting from the Western effort, that is, and the most rapid is the big Warp Speed initiative, which President Trump funded, where 5 vaccines have been going into a total of 150,000 people. They're not all getting vaccines. Some of them are getting control. And that's happening right now. And we will see interim reports on that. And we're hoping we may see some results by October. We've been hearing that the Chinese are vaccinating their military, but we haven't heard anything about results. And of course, there's the Russian discussion of going straight into the population. And again, we haven't heard any results yet. So until we hear some results, we do know the vaccines look to be safe. I'm not worried about the Russian vaccine from the point of view of safety. It's using a pretty much standard protocol. And also the Chinese one sounds pretty standard, though possibly a little bit more concerning until we see safety data. But we just don't know how well these vaccines will work. We're hoping they'll work well.
So I was with that secret hope that Professor Peter Doherty says today, in the first time and worldwide, that you have the vaccine for tomorrow. But that is not going to happen so quickly. Isn't that so, Professor?
We could see vaccine being rolled out in the United States and in Britain, and maybe other countries as well, if they've paid vaccine manufacturers to take a bet and make the vaccine for them, even if it may not work, which is what the Americans have done. They put $1 billion into each of the 5 vaccines that they're supporting through their Warp Speed tests, and that product, the actual vaccine itself, is being made. And if it works, they'll be rolling it out. If it doesn't work too well, it may still have a use, perhaps for boosting or something of that sort. We don't know. We'll just have to see. So it could be, though, very likely, I think, that we'll see a number of people being vaccinated in the United States, probably in Britain, in the first quarter of next year. Australia, we may be vaccinating the first quarter of next year, possibly by mid-year. But we have to see results first. And so until then, that's the best case scenario.
So this is, for all of us, the doubts we keep in our minds is, we see governments saying, we have a vaccine, and we see all the efforts from the healthcare system around the world and pharma. And as as a human being, as an individual, how can I know that I can go forward with a vaccine? I can trust it is the time, because we are hearing all of these different institutions, and as individual, how can I know, Professor, that okay, I should take the vaccine, it's safe?
Yes, the regulatory authorities look very closely at safety. That's one of their primary criteria. That's why, for instance, we heard that the Jenner vaccine was stopped for a while because they had something came up in one of the people who were on the trial. Of course, if you have 150,000 people on a trial, and some of them are older, which is certainly the case in the Americans, because they're looking at older people because they're using as their readout development of disease. And the older we get, the more we are likely to develop disease. So if you've got 150,000 people in a trial, it's pretty likely, if that trial's running for several months, that some of them are going to get sick from something. So you have to be sure it's not the vaccine making them sick, and that it's something else. And so that's what they're watching for, and they're watching for any safety effect associated with the vaccine. The trials are set up so that they have their own data safety monitoring committee, which is completely independent from the people making the vaccine. So they've got the job of ensuring safety. And FDA or European Medicines would then look at all that data before they registered the vaccine or licensed it, even for emergency use. So as far as we can test, the vaccines that come out there should be safe. But you've got to realize that the vaccine may have been tested, say, in 20,000 people, and if you give it to 20 million, you may see some side effects. Now, I mentioned briefly the side effect that you can see with influenza, with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a hopefully generally transient flaccid paralysis. So it's quite distressing, but it usually passes. Now, with influenza, you maybe get 5 cases of that in 100,000 influenza cases. With the vaccine, you can maybe get 1 or 2 cases of that in 1 million. So vaccination versus infection is all a matter of relative risk. The risk of taking a vaccine, there's always a finite risk with any medical procedure. There's also always a finite risk of crossing the street, but there is a finite risk. And so you've got to balance that risk against the risk of getting the infection. And so what you will have in the vaccine is only a little bit of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, whereas the infection has a lot of other bits that we don't fully understand what they're doing, and we think some of those bits, some of those genes, are actually compromising our immune system in various ways. And so, to me, the vaccine's a no-brainer. If it's been properly registered and so forth, I'll certainly be taking whatever vaccines are available. In fact, I'll take as many as possible because I need my immune system really boosted up because I'm old, and older people don't make good immune responses. So I think people can be reasonably confident, but we're certainly in Australia, we're not mandating vaccines. But what will have to happen, though, when you think about it, is airlines are not going to let anybody on board unless they can show they've been vaccinated. And a lot of venues are not going to hire people unless they've been vaccinated. I mean, if you're running a restaurant or a bar, do you want to hire someone who could potentially give the infection to your customers? So I think there's those considerations.
So for me, you look very young, Professor. You don't look old.
I wish.
Professor, when 2012, you wrote your book, Pandemics, What Everyone Needs to Know. And I quote, you said on the book, you explained that the rise of high-speed transportation networks and the globalization of trade and travel have radically accelerated the spread of disease. You also said that climate disruptions of global warming, rising population density, and growing antibiotic resistance all complicate efforts to control pandemics. This was 8 years ago. What about that, Professor Peter? You are back to the future, like in the movie.
There's nothing particularly prescient about that, because many people in the community I belong to are saying that. The public health people, the climate scientists have been saying it. Now, the major risk with climate science is, of course, the movement of mosquito-borne infections north and south of the equator and up into cooler areas. Those infections have been moving since 1945. There have been a number of mosquito-borne infections. Some have moved up into Europe, but many have moved from Africa across from Southeast Asia across to the Americas. And we can think of viruses like chikungunya virus, dengue virus, Zika virus, and West Nile virus. You may have experienced some of those in Spain. I'm more aware of the American situation. So they're a risk with climate change. But the major risk, I think, is rapid international air travel. That's an enormous risk. And some cultural practices in China and Asia, like live bird and live animal markets, and also the rapid destruction of forest environments. Also global hunger. We have a billion people a day who don't get enough to eat each day. So they'll be interacting more with wildlife. So the increase in population has been a major dynamic. All these things are interlinked. But the one thing I think that's most important with pandemics is probably rapid international air travel.
So you are telling us to stay home.
Well, we're all staying home at the moment. I'm certainly staying home.
Yes.
In fact, I'm locked down. I'm not even allowed to go more than 5 kilometres from where I live. We've had an outbreak here. We had very low case numbers, no community transmission. We did have an outbreak due to a quarantine breakdown. We were allowing Australians to come back from overseas, putting them in quarantine hotels for 2 weeks, and then letting them out after they tested negative. There was a breakdown there. We had an outbreak, and we're trying to stamp it back down again because we're almost free of the disease in most of Australia.
Professor, can we say that in a holistic way, we as human beings who live in this planet, we can learn with this pandemic, maybe we can change things, economic, political, organizations, leadership, parenthood, everything. I think like in a spiritual way, we're talking about science here, but this connection between everything, can we learn something? Because I understand by your words that me as an individual, I also can do, and I must do something about it. I can stay home, I can use mask, I can maintain social distance. We have been talking about that our last conversation. But this idea, can we learn the society with this call from the nature? Can we say this?
Yes, I think we can learn an enormous amount. I think we're all part of the human community, and when it comes to something like COVID-19, we all become very conscious of the fact, and that's also true with climate change, that we're a global community. Globalization is part of that, rapid air travel is part of that, even though our governance is at the level mainly of nation states, and of course in Europe you have the community as well, and we're still basically part of a nation state. That's how our governance works. But we have this globally interconnected community with no global governance. But apart from that, I think we can learn a lot about what works and what doesn't. I'm very much a pragmatist. We all understand, I think, that the 21st century is very, very different from the 20th century. And we all understand that because, for instance, the way we're talking now, we wouldn't have been talking like this in the 20th century. And we're conversing, I'm talking to people all across the planet. I was talking in Indonesia yesterday, and now I'm in Portugal. So that's very different. The exchange of information has totally changed. The role of newspapers has been totally changed by social media. the technological landscape has changed in a major way. We've made enormous technological advances. We're living longer and healthy lives than any time in human history. But we're also running into some very bad situations with climate change and environmental degradation. So I think this is a bit of a wake-up call. I think we need to use this pandemic, which is not the worst pandemic we could experience. The death rates are bad and they're killing a lot of elderly people, and we don't know what other health effects they'll have, but it's nothing like a really severe pandemic that could happen. Say we had something that was killing 10% of people, like the original SARS virus did. So our science is great and all the rest of it, but we can't just rely on that. We should look at this pandemic from every aspect: sociological, economics, science, politics, governance, and see what it is that it's telling us. We should learn from it, and we should learn from it in ways that will help us, I think, to go forward in ways that are more, I think, more essentially human and more sustainable. Some of the things we're doing, and I think less so in Europe than in some other places, they're not socially sustainable. They're too confrontational and too isolating. And I think we need to back off from a lot of this type of behavior. I hope we can learn.
And let me say you, Professor Peter, that you have a tremendous influence in all of us, because your work and all your passion of your life is dedicated and focused in helping the world and humankind to go to the future and to know how to deal with this. And I was also thinking that we suddenly, I think the countries and all the societies look at our healthcare system and to our professionals, and we start saying they are heroes. But the truth is that they were already there, they were already working a lot, and I think this is one positive thing about it, that we started to understand how difficult it is to be all day treating patients, giving their lives, taking perhaps the disease at home. And what you say, it's very important that science really has a place in our world to help this balance between politics, economics, and everything. And it's a huge contribution of you, of course. Professor, in Portugal we are now, we say that we are in a second wave of the disease. Now it's getting more cases, we are having more, the news are not so good as in the hot summer we had. What can we learn from the first experience when everything started in March and April? What can we do now? What have we learned? Can you tell us some tips, some ideas, please?
Yes, I'm not involved in the public health policy. I see that a lot of your people are wearing masks. That can be a big help. It raises awareness. It diminishes transmission from people who have the infection and may not realize it, because some people who don't have symptoms or have very few symptoms don't realize they've got it. So if you've got a mask on, you're less likely to transmit. And it also means if you do catch it through a mask, it's probably a much smaller dose. So that's very good. We do know that particular types of venues in particular cultures are more dangerous than others. And we know social distancing and so forth can work. So the medical professionals and so forth make recommendations, and they put the case for locking down and all the rest of it. But of course, it's up to policymakers to decide how far they'll go with that, because there are many other considerations, including economics, sociological considerations. So this is down to each and every government, and it's really, again, an equation that says, well, what disease load are we going to tolerate in the face of this pandemic? So they're the decisions that have to be made. We do know that you can easily get into a situation with this where disease numbers ramp up where you get into the situation we saw early on in both Spain and Italy, where your healthcare systems can be overwhelmed and you actually lose large numbers of your healthcare professionals to the disease. Now, the treatment of this disease has got better, as we've understood that it's both the coagulopathy, that is, there's blood clotting problems, and we've understood that the inflammation is very important in severe disease. Treatments with things like low-dose heparin and dexamethasone, and we do have some of the antiviral drug remdesivir, that those treatments, the doctors tell me, the physicians on the ward, that we're now saving about 50% of the people who would have died at the beginning. Those people will die, of course, if your healthcare system gets overwhelmed and you don't have adequate resources. So you've got to, policymakers really have to try to tread that balance in the context of what's politically feasible and the population will accept.
Fantastic. Thank you for your tips. And now a more personal question. How do you become interested, Professor Peter, in science and research? How do you get to this world and to this work you have done in all these years?
Well, I didn't start out to be a biomedical researcher. In fact, I trained as a veterinarian with the idea of doing science on diseases of domestic animals and trying to improve food production. That was way, way back when I was very, very young. I made that decision when I was 16. I don't think 16-year-old boys should make any decisions about anything, really, but I did. And for 10 years, I did research on infectious diseases and the pathology of disease in domestic animals. Then I was involved in a big discovery in a research lab, and I switched into biomedical research. I became an MD, which in my case was mouse doctor, because I was doing a laboratory animal research. And that's what led to the Nobel Prize and to my subsequent career. And now, of course, with the enormous improvements in science and technology, my younger colleagues are doing wonderful studies in human beings that when I started out were really quite impossible. So I've seen an enormous transformation in science, but I'm really driven by ideas and by passionate interest in discovery. I'm a discovery junkie. I like seeing new results and new data, and I'm rather good at looking at that and seeing things that at times other people might miss. And so I'm passionate about that. I think that's, when you discover something in science, you discover things that nobody has ever known before. Since the Nobel Prize, I've written a number of books, 6 books in fact, and 2 more on the way. And what I've learned with that is that no matter what you say in a book, someone always said it before. But in science, you make discoveries and you tell people about things that nobody ever knew before. They may not be much interested, of course, but it's new, it's novel, and it's exciting. And so it's that novelty and excitement of science that I found great. Now, I'm no longer in the research lab. I kind of miss that life a bit. My younger colleagues do that work, but old guys like me should not be using up scientific resources. They're limited in availability, and it's the young people who do the really exciting science.
So you can say this to the young generation to inspire them, that you are an example about this interest to discover things, and science is very relevant in our days, as you say to us, as you tell us, and your example. I have a question for our participants. I think they are very interested to know. I'm very interested to know, Professor, what is the formula to win the Nobel Prize? Can you tell us, please?
I wrote a book about it right at the beginning of trying to do popular science communication. I wrote a book in 2005 about how science works, how medical science works, why it's an interesting career, and why it's worth thinking about and what its strengths and weaknesses are. And my publisher suggested I should call it The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize. And because of that, that book has been translated into many different languages, because of the title, I think, more than anything else. The actual tips for winning the Nobel Prize are probably the tips for being successful at anything. Work hard, stay at it, don't let failure stop you, because you just have to keep going. And then also the one that's peculiar to science, discover something really big, but you know, you can't decide to discover something that's really big because everybody else would discover it. So discovery is random, and it's luck to some extent, and it's being in the right place at the right time. So we were lucky and made a big discovery. And then we did make something of it that other people didn't. And that's why we ended up with the Nobel Prize. But it's with science. If you're going into science for a career, basic science, it's a tough career because you're living off research grants. You're probing the unknown. You will fail, and fail quite a bit, but you discover by failure, basically, and it's not, if you were being successful all the time, it wouldn't really go very well. So that's about it. I can't really tell you how to win the Nobel Prize, I'm afraid, though I wrote a book on it.
But you helped me a lot with your final suggestions and ideas. So, Professor, we are now at the end of our conversation, and I know you like to discover things. And let me tell you that in our earlier conversations, in our change of emails, in our other Zoom meetings, I discover not only a professional of excellence, all the world knows about it, but I discover a magnificent human being that is enthusiastic, passionate about it. It was saying to me that you are going to make 80, so you look like 60 for me, for us. And let me also give you this invitation to discover Matosinhos, known by the world's best fish, known by the wonderful wine and wonderful sea. So I hope when this pandemic goes away, we can receive you here in Matosinhos, in Portugal, and to talk a little bit more with you, because it was really inspiring to hear from you and also to guide us, all of us, to take care about science, but also take care about our lives and our own families. So, Professor Peter Doherty, it was an enormous pleasure to have you here with us. I hope you can meet soon. And we are waiting for you with arms wide open in Portugal and Matosinhos. Thank you so much for your presence in the Connecting Healthcare.
Thank you very much, and have a great meeting. Be well.